NC Pork, raising the bacon, raising the bar. Welcome back to the North Carolina Sports Network and the Tobacco Road Basketball Show, known as Time Out. This is the Final Four edition of the show, and all of the number one seeds have found their way to San Antonio. The two guys above me keep finding their way back to Time Out each week, so let's tell you about them. Up in the left-hand corner is Coach Kerry Keating, former Seton Hall player, Santa Clara head coach, assistant at Seton Hall, Wake Forest, App State, Tulsa, where he won an NIT championship, Tennessee, Pittsburgh, and UCLA, and he is a two-time Final Four participant. And our returning champion in the upper right corner, fighting out of the city of Philadelphia, and a 38-year vet of rolling in the deep of the ACC. He's covered more than 30 NCAA tournaments and is a two-time North Carolina Sportscaster of the Year. Longtime practicing attorney, author, business owner, and North Carolina's top broadcast journalist, the one and only DG, David Glenn. And I am Mike Waddell, a recovering radio play-by-play guy going back 38 years. I've been a part of two NCAA basketball championship teams, one in men's basketball in 1993 and the most recent in 1994 with the UNC women's basketball Lady Tar Heels. I've been to a dozen Final Fours as an administrator and member of the media, and am blessed to be able to come here each week to Time Out and be a part of the best weekly basketball show in North Carolina. And gentlemen, last year it was NC State, and this year it's the Duke Blue Devils representing the Bold North State and the ACC at the Final Four. David, here at the North Carolina Sports Network, we are focused on telling the stories of the people, places, sports, and culture of the Bold North State, and it's hard not to imagine some kind of tie from North Carolina with the Final Four. It's a deep history.
It is, Mike, and it's great to be with you and Coach Keating, especially at this time of the year. You mentioned the two most recent examples. Let's not forget, famously in 2022, it was both the Duke Blue Devils and the North Carolina Tar Heels representing the Bold North State, as you like to call it, and they even played each other famously, with the Tar Heels sending Coach K into retirement. But we are the only state. Some might wonder, do we exaggerate the greatness of college hoops here on Tobacco Road? Well, maybe our opinions can be over the top at times. We'll let our viewers and listeners judge for themselves, but you can't argue with the facts. There is one state and only one state that has been represented in the Final Four 45 times. Mike, the second and third place states are California, mainly because of UCLA, but also some others. The state of Kentucky, mainly because of the Wildcats, but also the Louisville Cardinals, and occasionally others. They're in the 30 range. We are 45 trips in, counting this year's Duke visit to San Antonio. And that is, by the way, representing 5 different schools here in our backyard. Carolina famously has 21 trips to the Final Four. Duke now has 18. NC State has 4. And it's easier to forget the other 2, but the Charlotte 49ers have 1 back in the day, and the Wake Forest Demon Deacons have 1 back in the day. So 5 different schools, all based here in North Carolina, 45 collective trips. We have a lot of national championships to show for those trips as well. But whether it's California, Kentucky, Kansas, Michigan, any other state that might come to mind with college basketball, when we say Tobacco Road or the Triangle or the state of North Carolina is the center of the college basketball universe, those 45 Final Four trips now are a big part why we can not only say that, but we can back it up with facts.
I got a little jaded by being at one of those California schools and contributing to 2 of those multiple Final Four trips. You're thinking that I was at the center of the universe, but clearly knew, having been at Wake Forest prior to that Final Four trip and earlier stages of Tim Duncan's career, and obviously now here in the heart of basketball, it's clear, obviously, everything runs through here with Duke and Carolina at the forefront of that. Obviously, the trip that NC State made last year, now the revitalization, hopefully with Will Wade at the helm. No, it's a good place to be at this time of year. You know, it's a lot of fun, a lot of focus, and only fitting that one of those teams is back in the Final Four, the first time that we have a chalk Final Four since 2008, both in San Antonio. I was semi a part of that 2008 Final Four, not only because UCLA was in that, but also because Kansas won it. And at that time, my dad was the administrator overseeing basketball, and got a chance to share that moment with him on the floor. Another one, a championship from my father. Really special to him, really special moment. So a little bit of a tie-in and draw some back memories from what everyone's mentioning this week about the chalk Final Four happening again for the second time, the first time in that 2008 year in San Antonio. And here we are back in San Antonio. Really excited about what's to come in these games. And specifically speaking, the challenge for Duke. We've been talking about Duke all season long. And there hasn't been much other than what's next for Duke to do and who's next for Duke to beat, because obviously they ran roughshod through the ACC, save for that one hiccup, if you will, at Littlejohn against Clemson. And they've proven to be formidable. I got a little concerned just from the outside looking in, having been through this a little bit with Gonzaga in the West Coast Conference, running through the conference and maybe not getting challenged as much, albeit not as a different type of scale as the ACC historically. But that was always kind of the knock, that Gonzaga couldn't take that step because they weren't challenged during the regular season in their conference. I don't know if it's a fair comparison, but one to kind of think about given the state of what the ACC was in this year. But certainly in these first four games, and even most notably in that last Alabama game, Duke has proven to be all of that and then some. But I do think that not just because it's their next game and they can obviously lose it, this will be their stiffest test. I think even a stiffer test if they're fortunate to get through to the finals, which is a little bit of a benefit, which we'll talk about too, and having the quick turnaround, that their tougher game, if they're going to win two, is going to be the first one. It's different that it's tougher for the national championship, but tougher just in terms of the matchup itself and what that matchup brings in terms of challenges to John Shire and his staff.
It is Bacon and Basketball Month here in North Carolina. Our annual bracket contest brought to you by North Carolina Pork. And gentlemen, right now, over 300 people have piled into our men's and women's bracket contest. It is going to be fun to see who comes out as the Hoops Hog. But as you said, Carrie, it is a chalk Final Four, all of the number one seeds. And headed into this 2024-25 season, it was believed that Duke would be one of the teams to beat, both in the ACC and nationally. And John Shire's team has only improved over the course of the year. And in this new era, which is unlike anything other that has been the norm over our three lifetimes, I can't recall a gap that appears to be as big as the one on Tobacco Road right now between Duke and their fellow members of the Big Four. It is a Blue Devil world, and so far neither North Carolina nor Wake Forest have proven to be consistently prepared on or off the court to challenge that dominance, while NC State just made the Final Four a year ago, as you said, but then they dipped back outside of the tournament and have a brand new coach in Will Wade now over in Raleigh. DG, what would a Duke National Championship next Monday night in San Antonio do to further cement John Shire's program as the gold standard of this new era of college basketball?
Yeah, I like that word cement, Mike, because I don't think there's any doubt that Duke is the gold standard. I mean, what John Shire has done as the successor to Mike Krzyzewski, and history is filled with examples of really brutal attempts at following the guy. John Shire hasn't missed a beat, right? He's still signing number one recruiting classes. He is supplementing that talent with both returning players like a Tyrese Proctor on this year's team in the starting lineup, but also carefully selected transfer players like a Sion James, the starting point guard formerly of Tulane, or the healthier again, Malik Brown, one of the best defensive players in the ACC, he, of course, being a Syracuse transfer. I think Duke's place is rock solid, but I do remind folks that doesn't mean that the other 17 schools in the ACC are simply doomed to lick the Blue Devils' boots, so to speak, because we are in an era as we speak where the Louisville Cardinals just went from one of the worst two-year runs in the history of Cardinals basketball to hiring the right guy in Pat Kelsey and finishing a tie for second place in the ACC. just 1 year later after that 2 year rock bottom experience under Kenny Payne. Elsewhere in the ACC, the Miami Hurricanes have frighteningly little men's basketball history, but they went from being one of the lesser programs in the ACC to back-to-back Elite Eight and Final Four appearances under Jim Larinaga to dropping all the way to the bottom of the standings again. I mean, all that from rock bottom to two peaks, unprecedented in the history of Miami basketball, back down to rock bottom. I'm talking about in a period of about a half a dozen years. So you're not doomed to stay in the middle or the bottom if that's where your program is right now. You're not guaranteed to stay in the top tier if that's where your favorite program is right now. But I don't see any argument with the idea that Jon Scheyer and Duke are that gold standard, certainly in the ACC, but also nationally, because whatever happens in San Antonio this coming week, Jon Scheyer has another top recruiting class coming in, led by the Boozer brothers, sons of Carlos Boozer. If you haven't seen him, Cameron Boozer is a 6'9" superstar post player and future NBA lottery pick. His brother Caden Boozer is a 6'4" point guard. And there's a guy named Shelton Henderson coming in who's another just 5-star type guy. And there are players beyond that. We'll see how Jon Scheyer supplements in the transfer portal. But what do you have? You have a national championship pedigree at Duke, right? Coach K's 5 national titles. Maybe Jon Scheyer gets his first. You have recent history of success. Jon Scheyer's won 2 of the 3 ACC tournaments that he's coached in as a head coach. He also has, one of the most dominant regular season titles ever, as Coach Keating just referenced. Duke has tons of players in the NBA, including guys who had Jon Scheyer as their head coach and a bunch of others who had Jon Scheyer as an assistant coach under Mike Krzyzewski in Durham. I mean, what else do you want? You have a rabid fan base. You have a fun, famous atmosphere for your home games at Cameron Indoor Stadium. You have a world-renowned private university for moms and dads and others who may like the academic side of things. When you have recent success, historical success, fun facilities, proven head coach, and all NBA pipeline, fan craziness surrounding your program, the brotherhood over multiple generations of former Duke players, I don't know how you can exceed what Duke is setting right now as the standard. But I, again, remind everybody that just because you're at the top of the world doesn't mean you stay there forever. I remember times when it was hard to fathom how anybody would beat Coach K after he won back-to-back titles nationally at Duke in the early 1990s. Sure enough, Dean Smith in Carolina threw a national championship right down on the Blue Devils' heads the very next year as folks started to wonder about the Duke dynasty and was it going to last forever. It's hard to win national titles. Even at Duke, it's been a full decade since the last time the Blue Devils cut down the nets. So, yes, Jon Scheyer has cemented the Blue Devils as the gold standard in this new era of college basketball. But I think others are trying hard, and we're going to see a topsy-turvy roller coaster style ride where the stability that we saw for decades is out the window, and any even brand name program could be back in first place next year, or so low as in your NC State example, where they're in the Final Four in the ACC champion 1 year, and the very next year they're so far down the standings that they're not even invited to the ACC tournament. That's where the rest of college hoops is right now, but Duke is in as strong a place under a young head coach, Jon Scheyer, as anybody else in America right now.
Kerry, going into your coaching past, this has to be as volatile a landscape as you've ever seen. I mean, that's constantly the chatter out and about in college basketball land, but you could literally turn it around like Pat Kelsey and Louisville did this past year and a year, or you could see it go where North Carolina has gone, where they were seemingly at the precipice of another national championship in New Orleans before that second half against Kansas. And really, since then, it's been inconsistent times for the Tar Heels. Wake Forest hasn't made it to the NCAA tournament under Steve Forbes, and now Will Wade is getting ready to put together his best chance to put forward a consistent NC State winner. There's a lot of opportunity, but you could go one way or definitely the other.
I think I saw a stat where there were 9 NCAA tournament coaches this year that changed schools. And that's got to be some sort of landmark or record if we're keeping records. Obviously, the carousel always changes every year for different reasons. This year, it's changing almost in a self-induced way. A lot of those changes, as we know, were because changes needed to be made, whether it was a new AD, whether it was poor performance, whether it was retirement. These changes were to go chase greener pastures at every level. We just saw a coach that transitioned a school from Division II to Division I, Eric Olson at UC San Diego, go 36 or 32, win 30 something plus games, make the NCAA tournament. And in past, that led to a 10-year contract at a place like UC San Diego. And I got to tell you, for those of us out here who haven't been in San Diego, it's about as good as it gets in terms of a lifestyle. That's a good place to have a 10-year contract in. But Eric's now have a chance to move up. And as the dominoes fall, he ends up going to New Mexico. We can go through all the different coaching changes, one by one. But the point being is the time that we're in now is way more transactional than it ever was. And let's be honest, relational was at the forefront, and it kind of is emerging in different ways. And I think we'll have a lot of those stories this week, and mostly in the Houston area of things, maybe a little bit in the Duke area of how John's been able to cultivate these young kids. And he'll have to do it again, as David pointed out, next year. There's the relational pieces when you're in a position to recruit high school seniors that can impact as freshmen. They're not as jaded in the portal world yet. Now they're both all a part of the NIL and the salary cap world. So you do have that commonality between incoming freshmen and transfers. But this really puts a premium on having the right infrastructure in place to make the head coach the most effective he can be, to coach as quickly as he can. A lot of times in college, you were developing, you're creating some continuity. You'd have senior-laden teams, or even in some cases a fifth-year senior. Mix in a couple of young kids. You'd have a program. This is more of just a collection of talent that the head coach has to manage. And John has done that by way of having an unbelievable staff. And we pointed this out and detailed that almost a month ago in the ability that it's given John to coach his team. Much like John, the other number one seeds, I looked at Florida staff. I went to the first game that Florida played in Lenovo. They had literally the head coach and 8 guys, 8 at the front of the bench in polos or hoodie tops. 8. The players are like so far at the end of the bench, there was an NBA game. That is a whole change and shift, in that we're going to start to see a complete build out of staffs at the highest level that will enable a guy like John to continue this. I don't suspect a drop off for Duke, mostly because they're resourced and because they have someone at the head of the snake here that has proven he can coach. As Michael and I were talking about this, David, going into today, all due respect to Brad and to Pat and all the coaches in the ACC, even Nate Oates, who in his own right has emerged as a elite tactician of the game, mostly on the offensive end. This is really going to challenge John as a coach. This is a chess match of the highest level. Because let's not forget something about Kelvin Sampson. If it weren't for rules that changed before he got mixed up in some minor inequities, he'd still be at Indiana. And we'd be talking about Indiana being in their 5th or 6th Final Four. He also coached in the NBA. And I think that has not gotten enough play yet. And it may this week with the longevity we have heading into Saturday. Kelvin's background in tweaking and utilizing different coverages in defense is going to be on full display in this game, because even he in the Big 12 has not been challenged on his end in the way that Duke will challenge in the tools that they have, most notably by the emergence and the rise even further of Malwatch at the bequest of what Proctor did early, and now what Knipple and James and of course Cooper Flagg are doing to utilize him. This is going to be an unbelievable game on Saturday. I'm already juiced to break it down. I'm having watched some things and see what Houston can do, knowing that we have familiarity with Duke. But I think there's a game within the game right here. And if you're really paying attention and breaking it down, you'll see these moves being made between John and between Kelvin. They're going to be really some next level college basketball coaching we haven't seen in a long time.
The semifinal matchups, You have 5 full days to go back and forth with your assistants, your players, your rotation guys, the scout team. We're going to simulate this, man. For these genius coaches, that is a beautiful canvas that they get to leave their impression on. Whoever survives Saturday's semifinals, we're all aware that there is an assistant coach obviously assigned to either team you could face in the final. I'm not oblivious to that. However, no matter how great your pre-scout is, you've got one day of your guys' full attention prior to dealing with that national championship game. Coaching always matters, but that chess match that Coach Keating is talking about is even on greater display in those Auburn, Florida semifinal matchups, and even more so Duke Houston, because at least Auburn and Florida had to deal with each other during the regular season. So you are revisiting details in those cases. Duke and Houston, man, it's a totally different animal. And one quick postscript, 2 of the 4 coaches in the Final Four are coming off of show cause penalties from the NCAA. The highest penalty you can get as a coach is banishment from the sport. The second highest penalty that you can get is a show cause penalty. What does that mean? It means the NCAA labels you as essentially a black sheep. And if during the tenure of your show cause somebody wants to hire you, you have to go in front of the NCAA and say why you want to hire this guy who broke so many rules at a previous stop that the NCAA placed the show cause. So Bruce Pearl of Auburn, for one set of reasons, had a show cause penalty on him. And I thought of this while Coach Keating was describing Kelvin Sampson of Houston. Kelvin Sampson had a show cause penalty. Why did he spend 6 full seasons as an NBA assistant coach? Because at the time he had a show cause penalty because of the Indiana issues, which were mostly about text messaging players at a time when it was not permitted. But he was in the NBA for those 6 years because at the time, and this is not ancient history, this is less than a decade ago, a coach with a show cause penalty would not, it would be like he was 3 Mile Island nuclear facility. He was not going to be hired a decade ago in major college basketball. Fast forward a decade, obviously Bruce Pearl is a good coach and was hired by Auburn despite the checkered past of not only committing violations at Tennessee, but getting caught lying to the NCAA and telling witnesses that they should lie to the NCAA. I mean, that's sometimes the cover up is worse than the crime type stuff. But he gets a second chance, does great things at Auburn. Obviously, Kelvin Sampson gets another chance. He has done amazing things at Houston, both in the American Conference and now in the Big 12. And Will Wade, of course, of NC State fits this description, right? Will Wade was out of college basketball just 3 years ago for a full season because he was under a show cause penalty for the violations and the lying to the NCAA type stuff that he committed with the LSU Tigers, which is a program that still hasn't recovered from the sanctions that they were hit because of Will Wade's tenure there. Most of those rules are out the window, and maybe Wolfpack Nation can find solace or excitement beyond the obvious that they already have in the fact that, you know, Bruce Pearl and Kelvin Sampson are 2 of the last 4 coaches standing right now, and they went through the wood chipper, so to speak, with the NCAA, and they have bounced back in phenomenal ways.
I think in the case of North Carolina, you've got such a long-standing history of how to run a program. Obviously started with Coach Smith and transferred all the way to Coach Williams' return. It was inevitable that Coach Williams was not going to coach forever, and he made that decision to step away and, for all intents and purposes, picked Hubert as the next caretaker of the program. The issue is that the landscape changed, and it changed quickly and dramatically in a way that was kind of the antithesis of what Carolina was built on. And David, I ask you this question because you know better than anyone. Really can't recall any player of significance that made an impact at Carolina that would even think about leaving Carolina to go someplace else that wasn't the NBA. And this is just the world that we live in now. It's a transitional time where I think there will be probably a settling of the movement, because now that NIL is supplemental to salary. And for all intents and purposes, until there's a salary cap, and this really gets unified in a proper business fashion, you may not have people chasing greener passages or pastures, I should say, as much as just trying to make sure they're solidified in their own current environment. And that's where the local ability of NIL can balance some of those things out depending on where your cap is. That's why cap management becomes so important when this 22% rev share equates to $20 million plus for most of, if not all, the higher level schools. And you have to create some sort of market value, but you also have to create some local ties. I think it will come back to having some local, ties to be able to establish an identity locally that will garner you more NIL ability. And that's where the bigger markets, and certainly here you can take advantage of that. Local businesses, local entities that want to have partnerships with not just the players, but the basketball team. It'll help level the playing field. But in the interim, you can't get too far behind to where you're playing catch up. And I think to Michael's point, this is where the adjustment needs to be made by Carolina next year. Now, certainly Will Wade has come out swinging and said it's not going to be an issue for us in a year. We are, I know he said that at McNeese and he made guarantees and put that on film, but he seems to be, at least for the interim, heavily resourced by Boo Corrigan to have a chance to go in and get the best he can from a cost perspective. It really comes down to the evaluation part of that and how well he can mold that team together. It's really a mano-a-mano, if you will, they're both on level playing fields because Carolina may end up losing two guys that they maybe didn't anticipate losing in Drake, Palani, and Jackson, albeit to the NBA. But now they've already lost Elliot Cadeau. We don't know what else is going to happen as the transfer portal kind of shifts. You just have to be ready to be transactional and then relational. It's just a different way of doing things. Some of the guys that got in trouble earlier on, they pushed the envelope and maybe went over the line of that transactional relational, went transactional when you weren't supposed to be. But now, as we just talked about, here they are back. They can still coach. Will Wade's one of those guys. The immediacy of the pressure of Carolina to get themselves back on track was only magnified by Will showing up in Raleigh. And it'll be interesting to see what transpires in the portal and how it shakes out and what the rosters look like. And then we really don't know until the season starts how it all comes together. It's just that we're not used to seeing this at Carolina. It's a different comparison to what Duke has done, but there are elements of both Duke and NC State that I think Carolina has to address internally. And if you're a Tar Heel fan, the hope is that they are doing that, they have done that, and time will tell. But it's not a lot of time. It's literally time will tell, like next year it'll tell. That's just unfortunate that we don't have that time if you're a Tar Heel fan to build that. It has to happen now because you can get left behind again next year. And I say again, even though they snuck in this year, it wasn't very impactful past one first four wins. So it's time to pony up, in a lot of different ways over in Chapel Hill. And it'll be interesting to see how this new change and these shifts, roster-wise and support-wise, will affect Hubert's ability to coach a team next year.
Yeah, the good news for the ACC teams that are not named Duke is that this past year has taught them a lesson. And that lesson is if you don't change quickly enough with the times, you will be left behind. 1 year ago, as the SEC and the Big Ten were throwing a lot of money around, the ACC teams, for the most part, were throwing less money around. And Brad Brownell found a couple of great players in the portal, and he was back in the NCAA tournament. Pat Kelsey at Louisville found a whole bunch of players in the portal and lifted Louisville out of that 2-year basement up to second place in the ACC with Clemson. Duke obviously is in its own neighborhood. Carolina at least has the solace of, in a disappointing season by many definitions, they still played in the NCAA tournament. They still had a top 4 finish in the ACC standings. But State, Wake, and Carolina, different types of disappointment and different levels of disappointment, all learned the hard way that if you want to compete at the highest level, you need a bigger NIL budget. And you can't live in a world where the Big Ten or the SEC are plucking players off your roster the way the Kentucky Wildcats got Andrew Carr from Wake Forest, right? The way Auburn's Final Four team got Georgia Tech star Miles Kelly from the Yellow Jackets. We've given illustrations this whole season. There are 10 or more SEC starters that were plucked from ACC rosters, and there's one ACC starter that was plucked from an SEC roster. You can't lose those portal wars and expect to be the old school ACC. The other biggest change, obviously, and I think Coach's point is well taken, personal relations still matter. Like your caliber as a university, the fame of your program, your arena, your fan base, the attention, your players in the NBA, all that stuff still matters, but it matters on a secondary level below how much you got for me, right? Like what's in the bag, that kind of thing. And for most, so I'm almost 4 decades into covering this stuff. I would say for 35 out of 39, 38 seasons, on March 31st, a head coach would know 75% of his roster for the next year. March 31st, right? What do? You cross out the names of the guys that you know are out of eligibility. You write in the names of your high school signees, and that was 70 to 80 or even more of your roster. And then you tweaked. Maybe you added a spring signee. Maybe somebody transferred out, but back in those days, far fewer transfers because nobody wanted to sit out a year. Maybe you had an incoming transfer, but he wasn't going to be eligible that first year. But you still knew 75 or more percent of your roster on March 31st. On March 31st in the current system, there are some coaches who know a little more than half their roster. On March 31st, for the most part, in a sport that right now is 13 scholarships, but it might soon be 15 scholarships because of that lawsuit settlement, you might know 5 of your 15 players on March 31st. You might know 2 or 3 of your 15 players. That's a lot different than knowing 75 or more percent on March 31st. Now, by April 31st, these coaches will have the last day of April, excuse me, they'll have a much better idea of their roster. But now, guys, the Elliot Cadeau conversation at Carolina, what did it used to be? Are you happy here? Do you want to stay? Yes. Do you want me to stay? And the coach would say yes. That, as long as it took 2 to tango, the guy was staying, and that was your starting point guard for year 3. Now it's not, do you want to stay? Do we want you to stay? It's the next level. If you stay, how much money do you get? And if Carolina's answer to that is not what Elliot Cadeau thinks he's worth, or he thinks, or his agent thinks he can get more elsewhere, or maybe he wants a fresh start for beyond money reasons, now we're living in a brand new world, and that's not unique to Carolina. You are essentially doing 10 man-to-man negotiations with your current players, potential incoming recruits, and sometimes, guys, even the guys flirting with the NBA. Nowadays, you can negotiate for $6 million over 3 years as a second-round NBA draft pick. But they don't all get that. What if your second-round status gets you less than $1 million a year? Well, in today's world, your college might be able to offer you $1 million a year to stay in school, and that $1 million a year is a heck of a lot more than you're going to make if you end up playing in Europe. So all these dynamics have changed, and in the month of April, man, it is roster chaos. And rather than the old school rules taking effect, do I like that guy? Do I like his competitiveness? Is he a good fit for my system? Will he get along with his teammates? Will he work hard? Do I like his work ethic? Will his personality blend? All those things are still in play, but then you got to negotiate the number, and that makes all of this roster construction a lot more complicated than it was for most of the past 100 years.
NC Pork, good for the plate, great for the state. Now, David, you mentioned Elliot Cadeau and the transfer portal, which did open up on March 24th, and the number of athletes who have already opted in to seek greener pastures is overwhelming. You can follow that on our website at ncsportsnetwork.com. Our transfer portal logging and analysis is brought to you by Excel Moving and Storage. And why an athlete opts into the portal, it can vary from guy to guy, but rare is the case when there are not some highly charged emotions that come that really usually reveal themselves on social media, let's be honest. I mean, it's an easy way to vent your frustrations. In the case of Elliot Cadeau, the former Carolina point guard, his brother Justin, who is a gamer, a former college tennis player at Howard University, has come out and made some rather pointed remarks about some former UNC players who critiqued Elliot during the course of this season. Let's take a look at that right now.
I'll talk about it one time, and then mods, I need y'all to snipe who start annoying me about it, all right? I can't really speak on Elliot's side of things. That's for him to speak on. But I can tell y'all, why me and people close to me thought that, he should no longer stay at that school. First off, the first thing I want to say, Elliot did not ask anyone for $2 million. If you think Elliot care about money, you're stupid. There's a rumor going around that he asked for $2 million from UNC. He did not ask that. And it's so obvious that this is a rumor just to farm hate and have a cop-out for Elliot leaving. People are just trying to farm hate on Elliot. Oh, he's not worth $2 million. You know what I'm saying? He never asked for that. I want y'all to know that. The system, I don't think it fit Elliot. Elliot came up to school a year earlier than he should have. This should have been his first year, this year. But he came up early because he felt like he was ready. He didn't really have nothing to prove left in high school. With that happening, Elliot came up to a team that didn't really have a spot for him. You know what I mean? The one thing people could say about his freshman year was he wasn't shooting well. I'll say, as a brother, the coaches just didn't have much belief in Elliot, Like, it was at the point, Elliot shooting in a game, he missed a shot, coach taking him right out. If he missed. You know what that do to a kid confidence? Especially a freshman, a young kid coming in, looking to earn a spot, not really knowing what his role is. He's shooting the ball, he missed, he automatically out the game. I don't know if y'all would peep that when he played. That kills your confidence as a player, which I think to do as a coach is crazy, because he never had that problem. The UNC system, I just think wasn't for Elliot. I don't know if y'all watch, but at UNC, they don't shoot mid-ranges. The coaches think mid-range is a bad shot, which was one of Elliot's best shots, if y'all watched them. AAU, high school. If you watch a UNC game, go watch. They barely put up mid-ranges because they think it's a bad shot. On top of that, they also think floaters are bad shots. So that's why Elliot kind of was rim rushing a lot, because if they shoot a floater or two, it's a bad take. They're going to take you out the game. So, but that's their system. It might work for other players. It might work for their program. But I don't think for Elliot, that's the best play style. You know what I'm saying? So being limited to not being able to do that, I feel like that kind of messed with him. Throughout the season, I feel like Elliot got a lot of unnecessary hate. They had a terrible season. Not terrible, but not a good season for their standard. I think there's so many people you point fingers at before the guy who's averaging 9 and 6, one of the nation's leaders in assists. Yes, Elliot has the most turnovers on the team, but he's the point guard. Anyone who watches basketball knows the point guard gonna have more turnovers than anyone else. He plays on ball for 35 minutes. He has the same turnover ratio as any of the top assist leaders, and he didn't even have the worst turnover ratio on the team. And I also think it's really weird. I think the culture was weird. Mid-season, the alumni are attacking Elliot, saying, oh, it's his. They need a new point guard mid-season, by the way. Grown men who graduated from the school who don't even play basketball no more. That's when I personally thought, he got to get out of there.
You can ask anybody that knows me. I love Carolina basketball through and through. And I care about what goes on in our program deeply. We are not disrespectful. We love everything that has come with this. And I love every player that comes through Carolina, because you chose to be there and you chose to do what you can. I know what comes with the shit. We got cooked. I know, I can speak for me. I got cooked when I was at Carolina. Can you imagine playing a basketball game and you catch the ball and you about to shoot a 3 and everybody like, oh shit. Even the home fans? Home fans. I shot better on the road. But that's cool. It is what it is. You know what I'm saying? They care about what's going on. Listen, Elliot Cadeau gave us 2 good years. We would not have been where we were last year without Elliot Cadeau. Point blank, period. There's no chance, because we needed a point guard, and he did his job. I understand where this is coming from. I understand how they feel. At the end of the day, that's not where we were coming from. We come from a place of we love our school, we love our team, and we were just saying certain plays can't happen in certain moments.
Yep.
That's it. It was nothing to be disrespectful. It was nothing to say we hate you, because at the end of the day, the thing about Carolina basketball that I believe is different from everybody else is because everyone throws around this family bullshit. We are literally a family. I will never forget. I have never spoken.
I would disagree with that. But
except for one motherfucker. He know who he is.
Okay.
We need to revoke him from all fucking record books, and that's Rashad McCants. You suck. Get the fuck out of here.
My God.
Everybody else, I rock with you, because I'll never forget Vince Carter. I've never spoken to Vince Carter a day in my life.
Yeah.
Other than one time we played Brooklyn and he was with Atlanta. He came to me and said, Theo, I've watched you all your years at Carolina. I'll rock with you. If you ever need anything, I know you don't know me. You can hit me. It don't matter. That's how we operate. That's how we've always operated. And even if Elliot goes to another school and he calls Raymond, I swear to God, and I'm speaking for him, he will answer the phone and help him. So all this dumb narrative of that we trying to attack is so stupid, bruh. And all that comes from is Duke fans and NC Stank fans. I know where that's coming from. But at the end of the day, as a Carolina family, we rock with our team. We rock with our players. All we're doing is we understand time and score of certain situations. We critique that. If you can't handle that, you will not succeed at that next level. Because at the end of the day, if you fuck up there, they cutting your ass and you gone. Point blank, period. Yeah. I fuck with Elliot. I really do. If you watched our live stream when we watched the live game, we was in here cheering for his ass, going crazy. So at the end of the day, whatever you got to say about it, cool. I just needed to clear that straight because you ain't going to attack me and say, I'm killing our team. Listen, y'all don't even understand how much we care about this damn program.
David, after the 2023 season, North Carolina didn't make the NCAA tournament. A lot of fan criticism came down on one former Tar Heel, Caleb Love, who made the deep run in this year's tournament before falling out to the Blue Devils. The Arizona Wildcats took on Caleb Love, and it was a lot of social media chatter that was making it at least seem like the Carolina fan base was tough on the players. Now you have this seemingly come to the forefront again in the person of Elliot Cadeau and now former Carolina players Theo Pinson and the silent but obviously present right there Raven Felton in the film clip that we just saw, on the sideline, and they feel the need to speak out. Is the North Carolina landscape right now tough to manage if you're a player in this very sensitive time in college basketball?
Yeah, it is tough, but I don't think it's unique to the Tar Heels. I mean, we have an epidemic in our country of people who gamble on sports, who will personally attack college students, professional athletes. I mean, rabid, nasty, personal attacks on social media, other public forums where, from my perspective, you're just a horrible person if you do that. I wouldn't hesitate to say that to the person sitting right across. You're a horrible person for doing that. But of course, coaches have to be careful with their public words. The athletes themselves don't want to call too many things out because it can result in an even bigger avalanche of pushback on social media. It's a very complicated environment. As a college professor myself, I try to remind my students, many of whom have mental health issues, many of whom have anxiety issues, not even all of them being athletes. My advice includes, not everybody has an opinion that you should care about even a little bit. I think one of the reasons that the Carolina Elliot Cadeau story is extra sensitive, and I would even argue extra interesting, is that, of course, former Carolina basketball players of note making criticisms should make you pay attention more than just some random Joe or Judy who probably knows nothing about basketball, nothing about teamwork, nothing about high-level coaching or high-level athleticism. To me, it's easy to ignore. I used to tell my staff on my radio show all this all the time. If you really boil it down, there's two types of critics. There's the lazy, ignorant, cheap shot artists who just are angry and want to spread their venom somewhere. And you never learn from those people. They're just miserable, biased, clueless, conspiratorial morons. And you're not going to improve by listening to them. You're just going to confuse yourself by listening to them. And then there are fair-minded people who are actually paying attention. And I believe they're the critics that any of us, college basketball player, radio host, we can learn from fair-minded critics. Some of the most consistent critics that I had in my career, I would actually write to them because they were thoughtful and they made me think about something in a different way than I had thought about it previously. So even though they were a little antagonistic on the front end, I viewed it as sort of a gift. I wish it had been delivered a little bit more nicely than antagonistically, but I learned, right? I improved because someone saw something from a perspective that I had not fully wrapped my brain around. If I'm Elliot Cadeau, or his brother even, And I thought some fascinating basketball angles. I don't know how much of the details Coach Keating caught, but I would love the coach's perspective on part of Elliot Cadeau's brother's feedback was about, hey, what about these former Carolina players taking shots at my brother? And that's one subject. As a media member, I would be more likely to defend what Theo Pinson or Justin Jackson or those other Carolina players said because I thought it was coming from a fair-minded place. The other things that Cadeau's brother brought up had to do with, for example, the value of a mid-range jump shot, the value of a floater. And the way Elliot Cadeau's brothers told the story, it was that Elliot Cadeau, who's not a tall guy and doesn't have extraordinary leaping ability, was told that, and this is just Elliot's brother talking, essentially there's values to three-pointers, there's value to alley-oops, and there's value to getting all the way to the rim. It's kind of like the Nate Oates Alabama approach, where it's, the best shots are either three-pointers or layups and dunks, and we don't want a lot in between. Well, if you're Elliot Cadeau, and if you get too close to the rim, it's probably going to be a block shot. There could be a value in floaters. There could be a value in mid-range jumpers, even though a lot of coaches don't want to see mid-range jumpers. So who's right, who's wrong? You can debate that, and coaches who know more than I about that can have that conversation. But certainly, Elliot Cadeau shouldn't have been caught blindsided by how Hubert Davis and his staff were teaching basketball. I mean, on the recruiting trail, they saw enough Elliot Cadeau video. It's not like he changed his size and shiftiness, right? Like they knew what they were getting, and he knew what offense he was being plugged into. So they can have that debate, but I thought that was stuff that typically stays behind the curtain that became public about Elliot Cadeau not liking essentially how he was being coached. But the player part, if I'm Elliot Cadeau, Mike, and I read that, I think it was Justin Jackson, if you guys can correct me if I get this part wrong, but it's a former Carolina player who said, I watched Elliot Cadeau work out multiple times, and the overwhelming majority of the time, he was not practicing shots that actually happen in games. If I don't care if I'm 15, 17, 19, or 25 years old, if a former Carolina player who wore the same uniform that I did made that observation, rather than being mad at the guy, I might send him a thank you card because maybe there's a better way to work out, a smarter way to work out. Elliot Cadeau led the ACC in turnovers. Were there things he could have been doing on his own or in practice to get better at decision-making? Elliot Cadeau has been a horrible three-point shooter. Is there a type of three-point practice that more simulates the kind of threes that you get in games rather than the easygoing ball boy tosses you the ball and you take this relaxed three-pointer, which rarely actually happens in a game? I thought, hey, Theo Pinson and those guys, they have to make a decision about how candid they're going to be as podcasters or whatever else. And we live in a world overflowing. Mike, one of the reasons our North Carolina sports network is successful and has grown exponentially on YouTube and otherwise is that we are at neither end of the spectrum. In fact, I created the ACC Sports Journal and ACCSports.com in the 1990s on the short list of reasons that we became the best-selling college sports magazine in the history of the world in the 90s and early 2000s. One of the biggest reasons for that is that we were neither homers nor haters. And even mainstream media sometimes now falls into either homers or haters. Well, those are two very different types, not even journalism in my opinion, but media coverage, we'll call it. Haters and homers have entirely different points of view. Homers can be too overprotective, sometimes not critical enough. Haters are just blind, lazy, ignorant, cheap shot artists. And again, all fan bases have some of them. If Theo Pinson and some of these former Carolina players don't want to be viewed as entirely homers, well, it's fair to point out that Elliot Cadeau can't make certain mental mistakes at key moments in big games that are close games. That's not like a personal attack. That's admitting something that's kind of obvious. You can't make those sorts of mistakes at those kind of moments, except they're doing it through the eyes of guys who started Carolina and played in the NBA, which adds to their credibility. So part of it is that the Cadeaus have to get tougher skin about the basketball part. I follow Elliot's mom on social media. She's right about most of the life observations that she makes. That family got bombarded for all sorts of different reasons. And Mrs. Cadeau is kind of a shining beacon of truth, in my opinion, against a bunch of racists and bigots and conspiracy theorists and nonsensical, idiotic Americans. That poor woman took it from all angles. But when it comes to the basketball player, I think there has to be some tougher skin, especially when the criticism is coming from Theo Pinson, Justin Jackson, and other Carolina Tar Heels who care about their school, care about their program, support the players, right? Some of these guys were separated by 15 or 30 years, and yet they give each other their phone number and say, anything you need, just call me. So with candid observations, there's also a support group in there. So nobody's 100% wrong in all of this. Not Elliot's brother, not Elliot himself, not the former Tar Heels on their podcasts. It should be, at best, it should be a learning experience. But at worst, I don't think there was a bad guy anywhere in that, from Elliot to his brother to the former Tar Heels to Elliot's mom. I don't think anybody should be viewed as the villain. This is just how stuff is going to work now. And, there's no magic wand that anybody can wave to make angry, nonsensical people disappear on social media and otherwise.
Let me throw some fuel on that fire, because there might be a villain in all this in the end, and it could be Will Wade. Because the most hurtful thing that's going to happen, if it does happen in this day and age of being able to do so, because remember, you could transfer in the past, couldn't transfer in your own conference, is if Elliot ends up in Raleigh. And forget about all the vilification that'll come down when they play head-to-head, especially in the Dean Dome, and whatever happens online. That may be the de facto villain that is non-existent, as David so eloquently pointed out. There's a disconnect here. And the one thing that at least Elliot's brother was able to utilize his platform for, to clarify, was to discredit anyone out there that said, oh, he wants $2 million and they're not going to give him $2 million. Like, okay, we'll take that as a certified truth. Like, that's not the case. He's not leaving because they wouldn't give him $2 million. Right. So let's just get that out of the ether, which they did. But the other part of it too that I think hasn't been discussed enough, and correct me if I'm wrong, didn't he leave school a year early to come? Okay, so I tried to do this in 2008 when I was at UCLA. I saw the path to this over 16 years ago, that kids would be better served in our program at UCLA than their senior year in high school. Very, very difficult to do, because you don't want to take away from the social aspect of a high school senior. And you certainly don't want to take away from the possibility of being with your teammates. It all depends on the circumstance and the situation, of course, but it's a very difficult thing to do. We were unsuccessful in doing that, ended up signing 3 point guards in 1 year in 2008, Jeremy Anderson, Malcolm Lee, and Drew Holiday. I was trying to offset that by bringing at least one of them in earlier. I say that because they were successful in doing that. And it either came from the push from the Carolina staff or the willingness from the Cadeau family, or a little bit of both, to say, hey, you can make an impact for us by coming here early. Now, I don't know if it was ever discussed that he should come early and wait, because if I'm not mistaken, Caleb Love was still there. RJ Davis was still there. So he came into a little bit of a crowded room in the guard situation, if you will. But at least they thought of him highly enough, and he did well enough and showed well enough athletically, and probably from a maturity standpoint, to handle that. That's not common and easy to do. This isn't football where kids live halfway through in gray shirt. That said, starting out that way and not having a clear path to your development and what you're really good at and able to do. And I'm going backwards now as a revisionist historian on what Elliot's brother said, that if he felt most comfortable in a mid-range, in a float game type situation, there's a place for that. We don't have to overanalyze and take it out of the game. Matter of fact, Nados was just quoted as saying, hey, we don't always need to shoot a 3 if we can't get a layup. If we only need 1 or 2, a kid that shoots 50% from mid-range is analytically better than a 40% three-point shooter, because that 10% means it's going to go in and at that time get us what we need. So you got to be careful to really dissect all this, other than, I think, just get down to the brass taxes here. It didn't work out. It wasn't a good fit. It's easy in this chair, especially as a former coach, to look at the coaches, because you can kind of see some things that maybe they can do. Not that it's easy to do. It's also easy to sit in Elliot's brother's chair and say, hey, Elliot wasn't able to do this, so we're at an impasse here. It's not an indictment on either one of them, other than the awareness and the stature that Carolina basketball has, especially in the point guard position historically. And this is part of the issue that Hubert and their staff are going to have, as we mentioned. You have to be surgical in exactly what the expectations are and exactly what your player development is. But you also got to kind of live a little bit with what the kids can already do, because you're not going to have a time to develop them in the way that you necessarily exactly want them. This is the malleability that you have to have as a coach with a talented player. Take what he can do, emphasize it, but also realize there are some aspects of his game that you may necessarily have wanted to utilize that he's really good at. You have to find a way to utilize them. I don't have time to go back and watch all of Carolina's game, David and Mike, but I'd be willing to bet you that some of those turnovers that plagued Elliot Cadeau were a result of him being mentally, I'm not unstable, mentally unsure of what play to make, because in his mind, the right play may have been in said mid-range or a shot. I don't really ever remember emphasizing playing off 2 feet, getting in the lane, having cuts, kickouts. They didn't have a bona fide shooter out there to kick it out to, save for one 7 for 10 game from Withers, right? So I'm trying to play both sides to the middle because we can, because I think the Carolina faithful, they just want an answer. They want an answer, because he always had an answer at Carolina. It was either it worked or it didn't. And in the case of the former players, it's a little bit of an adjustment on their part too. They want to be supportive. They're Carolina blue blood till they die. They'll bleed it. They want everyone to feel that love, even in the short time that they may be at Carolina, because it's not going to always be 4 or 5 years. If this were me, and I'll leave you with this, if it's me and I'm on the Carolina staff, I'm actually taking a different approach to former player relations now than ever before. Because here's how it worked in the past. End of the summer, former player reunion, the guys are in the NBA, have the time before they go to training camp, all the kids come on campus, have a big cookout, do a little blue-white scrimmage, maybe you have a camp going on. Everyone feels great about it. Shake hands, dap up. This is me. This is you. Share stories, getting ready. Everyone's excited. Roll into the season. That ain't happening anymore. Now I think the onus is on to control the messaging as part of the Carolina faithful. If these guys, Theo and Ray, are really that adamant about grabbing a mic and speaking into it, you can't tell them what to say. But if they really do want to help Carolina, I would love to see all of the Carolina players once a month, maybe have a monthly gathering if they're local, and do this with all of them in a room with the coach, with the coaches, because it's still very, very powerful in what they have historically have. They have to figure out a way to mold this in a future sense to kids that aren't going to be there for 4 or 5 years and aren't coming there to get their numbers alongside the others in the banners. They're trying to be maybe a part of a banner being hung as a team, but they're also very different in that they're going to get the bag now. Everyone else got it later. We still share the common bond that we wore the uniform. I think you just need to have a little bit of unification of messaging here in a supportive sense. Realize it's not always going to work out. Be a little bit more forthcoming and upfront to identify talents that kids may have that you may not have a time to realize what it is until it's too late. And in the case of Carolina, I don't know this to be the case, but I can tell you this. If, and speculative if, Elliot Cadeau is wearing red and white next year, and if that results in a mid-range or a floater, that if Carolina loses to North Carolina State, There will be no if as to what the next post will be about what happened the last time. Like, this is the drama that's being created right now. So it's good theater, but I think it's just opportunistic, and it's just a step back to realize the current state. And you hope that it works out for both of them. The pressure's on Carolina because Elliot's a talented player, and it could be a double dip if he ends up going down the road and playing at NC State.
Hey, one last thing to remember is that these coaches, even somebody like a John Shire at Duke, there is a massive difference between I wanted to keep player X and he transferred out versus I wasn't sure how much I wanted to keep player X and he transferred out. Two very, very, one's a red flag, the other is not a red flag. Mark Mitchell started multiple seasons at Duke, and 1 year ago the attitude was, well, maybe you'll be better off at Missouri. Jeremy Roach started 4 years at Duke, and 1 year ago the attitude was, well, you might have a better role at Baylor. So not all breakups are miserable breakups. Not all breakups mean that the team someone's leaving is falling apart. The key at Duke is they had so much talent stacked in the form of Cooper Flagg and Kaman Malawach and Con Knipple, plus Tyrese Proctor, plus Sion James on the way in. When you're dealing with it from a position of strength, you can say even to multi-year starters that you like, hey, your role here next year might not be what you want. Not all transfers are bad. Carolina, of course, looks one way if Ian Jackson, Drake Powell, and others, Seth Trimble, etc., stay with the Tar Heels. Everybody forgets about Elliot Cadeau if the Tar Heels sign an incoming point guard who does various things better than Elliot Cadeau did. But if point guard becomes a headache for Carolina next year because of the way the dominoes fall in April, well, then all of this is going to be super scrutinized. We're living in a world, guys, where Auburn's best player, Janai Broome, is formerly of Morehead State. Florida's best player, Walter Clayton, is formerly of Iona. Obviously Duke is built differently with their best players being incoming freshmen from the high school ranks. But the other three teams are a blend of really, really high impact transfers. And then, a few of those old fashioned high school signees.
Yeah, I would say you pick and choose your own poison here because there's plenty of it out there. And again, we talked earlier about what will come out in the storylines this week. As David knows, you have a full week of media coverage and media responsibilities, both local and then soon national when the teams arrive in San Antonio. And I'd be willing to bet you're going to hear a lot from Kelvin Sampson about how he constructed his roster and how low level of issues that they have. I did see one short clip about that. Someone might have asked him that after his last game or game before. Not that that's the gold standard, but it's just an example, obviously, of what we're going to hear about from at least one of the four constructed rosters in the Final Four this weekend. As a result to moving forward, the relational transactional part, I think, really comes to the forefront. What it also puts the onus on is your staff to not just speed date and get kids to feel really good about their potential playing time and earnings now at said school, but really don't wait to figure out who's important in their lives. And I know in the past you were kind of doing a dance with these kids, because you really didn't know. And by and large, it started very early. I started recruiting Kevin Love when he was 14 years old. I'm thinking about my son right now as a freshman in high school. I can't even fathom a grown adult contacting anyone in my son's life to talk about going to college. Now, I'm not even here to tell you that my son's anywhere near what Kevin Love is. If he is, good for all of us. But just in comparison, there was a relationship time to build there, to figure out what really meant the most to Kevin. The flip side is we didn't have as much time in recruiting Russell Westbrook. It was almost the opposite end of that because we didn't start till the end. So I did have to figure out rather quickly who was important in Russell's life. And that was an easy one because obviously rooted in his family and at the time his high school coach, Reggie Morris, it was a little bit easier to decipher. The in-between of that now, especially when you're primarily recruiting in the portal, and I'll address that portal side first, is one, identifying if it fills a need on your roster, but then two, making sure you make the most of the contact that you have to figure out what's really important, and not as much to get them to come to your school, but to get them to stay, because they still have a chance to leave. And you don't want to be going through that every single year times 10 or 11. Same thing with a high school kid now. Whatever time you put in, and mostly higher level schools are going to do this, because let's face it, those are the kids they feel can impact on the court right away. You need to make sure you know who's because there's other reasons for people in your camp to call shots now. In the past, this was kind of like the hidden secret. Well, take care of this guy and we'll make sure a guy goes to your school. Some guys got in trouble for that, some guys didn't, but it was a known fact that you had to take care of people. There were different ways to do that. Now you need to know who those people are so you can get ahead of what their voice is causing an issue of. And I'm not saying that Elliot's brother is an issue in all this, but clearly he's got a platform. Everyone has a platform now, really, if you think about it. Heck, there's a guy 10 million people are watching run around in circles and put his face in spring water right now. And anyone can become a viral sensation now. As it relates to college basketball players, you're now kind of ancillary attached to that player. And in Elliot's case, a top 20 player, you and yourself can become a viral sensation just by being in the camp. You really got to be pointed as a coach to know what's really important to the player, and then what's really important past the point when you get that player in your camp and have a direct relationship with that player. It puts the relationship building on steroids, and you really have to be skilled and crafted at it. And I think what you're seeing here in the case of the teams that are in the Final Four, you have four guys that are pretty dang good coaches, but they're also pretty skilled communicators and relationship builders in different ways. Those type of guys are the guys that you need to value the most, in my opinion, for the short term until this all levels out and we figure out a way to kind of administer this in a more civil way. You have to have those relationship skills while not taking away from your coaching skills. And you really need to know who to have relationships with around those players as well, so it doesn't come back to bite you in the end, giving them access to whatever you're doing, and all of a sudden the truth comes out. And you never really know what that truth is, so you have to live in your own truth with your player, direct and foremost. So different types of challenges for different times, but it really puts the onus on coaches now. They get paid a heck of a lot more money than they ever did to handle it the right way, and also have now the ability to get more people on your staff to help you in part make sure you handle these things properly.
If you are anywhere near Wilmington, North Carolina, and looking for a little live music, a cold beer, a tangy slushie, a fun crowd, or just a taste of the good life at the beach, Jimmy's Bar in Wrightsville Beach is the place for you. Located on North Lumina Avenue, just one block from the sand and waves of the Atlantic Ocean, Jimmy's features a full bar with nightly beer and drink specials, and it hosts musical performers almost every day of the year. One more fun fact, Jimmy's annual Children's Bike Drive, which started in 2017, now distributes more than 1,000 bicycles and helmets per year to young people in the Wilmington area and beyond. Jimmy's Bar, your home away from home on Lumina Avenue in Wrightsville Beach.
One of the things that is an absolute during March Madness is chaos on the campuses of the teams that have won regionals and are now getting ready to go to the Final Four in San Antonio. Kerry Keating, on multiple occasions, you've been on staffs that had to do the rush, not only logistically, but also competitively, to get ready for that semifinal Saturday matchup. Take me back in time. What was it like as you and the UCLA staff were getting ready to get prepared for your next opponent, but you also had to move like an army of people from Westwood to the Final Four?
It's a euphoric time. Obviously, I think the most excited you are is after the Elite Eight, because there's nothing else you can do but celebrate. And literally, as soon as that is over and you've settled the dust of the media and the family, congrats, and friends, you almost immediately turn towards what's next because you know what's at stake, right? Inevitably, you're here at the Final Four. You know, the first order of business is to get your tickets out of the way immediately out of the way, because whereas you will have friends that are there because most of your coaching counterparts are already getting tickets to the game, you know, the family comes in. You know, obviously you want to make sure you take care of the right people, but then there's also priorities in terms of where these tickets are going to be at. And you have to have a pretty good, stable support staff to handle all those requests and the communication that happens between. Now, in the case of the assistant coach, a little bit different nowadays than it was even 15 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, where you were chasing down films. Now, just a little bit of a side note, there was a outfit called Hoop One Video up in the Northeast that had towers of VCRs that would record games that were on all year long and a wall of library of games. And then they would utilize those VCRs to be outputs for copied recordings. And as soon as you knew who you were playing, you'd be on the phone and you'd be requesting the tapes. And in the case of us, we could drive down the turnpike. If everyone else, they had to have them shipped or put on an airplane for same day. Now you just dial it up on the computer. You know, I think getting the distractions out of the way early will help you as an assistant focus on the task at hand, which is coming up with a game plan to win the first game. You know, and as we talked about before, it's a 3-team tournament, if you will, with the 2 teams on the other side, but you can't get there till you take care of the first one. And in the case of the coaches, you have now a video staff and an analysis staff that may feed all the data in and all the metrics while you're actually watching the film. We already talked about the fact that Auburn and Florida have familiarity. There's a little bit of familiarity on the case of Duke and Auburn having played each other, and same thing with Houston. I don't know if they each had a chance to play against Florida. But you put all your eggs into that first basket, if you will, you know, knowing that you have some trusted assistants and staff getting a game plan ready for either of the 2 teams if you're fortunate enough to win the first one. You also have to be ready to make some pretty quick decisions because you don't want to go into practice the second time changing your said game plan after the first day. Because unless you have the type of team that doesn't need that type of mentality the first day of practice, at least by that second day, you have a game plan in place. You have to make some decisions. Now, I'll use my own personal experience as a decision. We at UCLA played ball screens in what they call a hard hedge and show and get under the hedge and recover and tag and switch out. And it was successful for us at UCLA. LSU had a player named Glenn Davis, not in the best of shape, if you will, and had a propensity to set most of their ball screens on the side of the floor in the outer thirds, if you will. Well, it was pretty obvious when we watched film that we could exploit that in a way that we could recover quicker than Glenn Davis could hurt us off the ball screens. The decision that we made and made it as a staff pretty quickly, and before we got to Indianapolis and had our first practice off site, that's really where you want the game plan in place, was we're going to trap these ball screens. And we're going to trap them outside what we call the funnel. We built a funnel from the elbows out almost at a 45, maybe less. Anything outside that funnel, we were going to trap. Because that's where the majority of their screens at that time were being set. And we literally ran Big Baby to the bench. I don't know if you recall, in 2006, there were video clips of him, although I didn't see him till after. I'm just gassed and out of breath and just, I don't even know if he had oxygen, but we ran LSU out of the gym, literally, and had success early on that LSU could never recover from. Problem was, Florida got a little bit of a break plan, an 11 seed against George Mason. Not to take anything away from Coach Larinaga and George Mason, but I think they also were able to ascertain what we were going to do and they were going to do against us a little bit better than we were against them. Because I remember even in preparing for George Mason, we had to prepare for both. You want to be focused in your game plan. You want to make decisions and stick with them. I think it speaks to the type of team that you have. And if you have to stick with your guns and we're going to live by the sword, die by the sword, or are we talented enough to exploit something in the other team that maybe we found? And in this day and age of analytics and lineup matchups. I'll just use an example. In pulling up Duke and their efficiencies, and this is something that we really haven't gotten that nuanced in here on the show, but the best two-man defensive, effective, or efficient lineup, two-man, just these two guys on the court together for Duke, of course, includes Cooper Flagg, but it's Zion James. So if you're Duke, you probably have a level of comfort with Zion James being on the floor. The issue that's come up in the success that Tyrese Proctor has had is that he's the fifth most efficient guy from a defensive standpoint because he doesn't crack the two-man, three-man, or four-man efficient lineup, rather the five-man, which is the one we've been seeing a lot of. And obviously that's Flagg, James, Knipple, Malawach, and Proctor. So are you comfortable if you're John Shire and you look at the minutes in the last two games? Caleb Foster, 4 and 15. Isaiah Evans, 4 and 5. Malik Brown, 3 and 4. Mason Gillis, 12 and 6. Patrick Naganga, 12 and 6. What that tells you is that he's leaning on those five guys. And you got to kind of rob Peter to pay Paul here if you're Houston. And we'll get into a breakdown of what I think Houston can do to neutralize some of the things that Duke can do. But just from a pure first view statistical standpoint, I would dive in if I were Houston and say, how can we get Proctor? Because if you substitute Malik Brown in, he goes from the second-ranked defensive player individually. Proctor moves down to 7. There's a cat and mouse game here. Houston, being so defensive-minded, may remove a threat in Tyrese Proctor by attacking him defensively early. The best way to maybe guard Tyrese Proctor is to make him guard you. I think they'll put Duke in single empty-sided situations with Proctor early. They'll force Malawach or Flagg into those situations with Proctor on an empty side where they have to make decisions in either switches or show and recovers or long recovers on the opposite side. Because let's not forget something else about this Houston team, guys. This blew me away because I didn't realize this till this weekend. They are the number 1 three-point shooting team in the country. I never would have thought that about Houston. Never. Over 40%. 3 guys shooting over 40. So you got to make some decisions here on both sides of the ball. And when you remove a threat on offense and kind of whittle down your options on who to guard, in this case, obviously it's Knipple, Flagg, and now Malawach, who's become an elite roller. He's probably moved himself up 4 or 5 slots in the draft just in this tournament alone. But the ball pressure and now the decision that you have to put Duke in is, can we manipulate their lineup offensively by forcing their hand defensively? And that means Proctor off the floor. You take Proctor off the floor in this tournament, now you really put a lot of focus and pressure on Flagg and Knipple. But if they can take Malawach away from the basket, it neutralizes his shot blocking, and it puts Cooper Flagg in a position where it's going to come down to the whistle. And that's always an interesting side note as to who's officiating the games. I'll leave you with this for lack of being too verbose here. You're not supposed to know who's officiating the games. This is actually a funny side note. I think in our second Final Four, you're not supposed to know who's officiating the games as the Final Four participant until a certain time, like later in the week. Well, we got to either Indianapolis, I'm pretty sure it was Indianapolis, or maybe Atlanta. I can't recall, one of the first two. And we went out to dinner as a staff separately than the team. And lo and behold, on the other side were the 10 officials eating in the same restaurant. NCAA's got to do a little better job protecting their guys and maybe cater this stuff in. Not that it was an advantage, but if you're skilled at communicating with the officials and you kind of know how they call games, you can go back and now analyze that just as much as you can a player. It may help you just a little bit, an iota in your mindset. But at least you have an idea of what to expect, especially for someone who's participating in the tournament for the first time like John, just to remove any doubt or any inequities in your mind. But there are things that I think Houston will do early on to try to get into Duke's bench and try to force lineups for John that may limit his ability to be the offensive mind that he's been with this seemingly, strong five of Flagg, Proctor, Malwatch, Knipple, and James. It's going to be very interesting to see what Kelvin Sampson comes up with offensively, because he's known as a defensive coach. But to have a team that led the country in threes, this could be a tough one. This is going to be an unbelievable chess match between these two coaches.
NC Port, raising the bacon, raising the bar. Let's take these two games in reverse order. First, in San Antonio, we'll talk about Houston and Duke, both number one seeds. This game tips at 8:49 Eastern time on Saturday evening. David Glenn, as we talked earlier in this week's edition of Timeout, the state of North Carolina has Duke into the Final Four. This is a real fun matchup between a veteran head coach in Kelvin Sampson, native of North Carolina, and then you have John Shire, who is the North Carolina transplant and one of the younger coaches to take his team to a Final Four. What do you see in this game that just hits you right off the top?
Well, one thing that I want to remind everybody is we all hear the fact that Coach Keating mentioned earlier in today's show, first year where all four number one seeds make it to the Final Four since 2008. In the broader picture, this is only the second time ever. So they've been seeding the field since the late 70s. We've had almost 50 years of seeding the field, and this is only the second time ever, along with 2008, that the top four got to the Final Four. So people should buckle up for some big time matchups, both in the Duke-Houston game, but also Florida against Auburn. The second thing that jumps to mind is that Kelvin Sampson factor that Coach Keating referred to earlier, whereas Kelvin Sampson has had great defensive teams essentially everywhere he has ever been, and he has been successful at multiple schools. Especially his recent teams, which, those Houston teams in their last few years in the American Athletic Conference, they either won the regular season or the tournament or both in that league every year. They're only a couple years into their Big 12 membership, but they have been at the top of that conference both of those years. And the foundation has been defense first. Well, when collectively you are literally the best three-point shooting team in the nation for stretches of this year, they're almost at 40%, the Houston Cougars as a team. Duke didn't deal with anybody like that in their 20 ACC games this season. But individually, just in their starting five, LJ Cryer is the Baylor transfer, 42% from three-point land. Milos Uzan is the point guard, another really good experienced player, 45% from three-point land. And Emmanuel Sharp is the other perimeter player. He's a 42% three-point shooter. So the three starting guards are even better than the roughly 40% team percentage. And we know Houston can play defense. Both the Blue Devils and the Cougars were top 10 in the nation on that side of the ball. Houston was actually number one defensively. Duke was number 4 out of 364 Division I men's basketball teams on the defensive side of the ball. So both teams know what they're doing defensively. Both teams are consistent defensively. And I think it's going to come down to who has more weapons against whatever defensive game plan John Shire or Kelvin Sampson comes up with, who has more weapons and can put the ball in the basket. And the scary part for the Blue Devils is, even though Duke is the favorite here, the Houston Cougars not only are elite defensively and not only are elite from three-point land, they love to play at a slower pace. And if you're the underdog, why not slow things down, minimize possessions, and maximize your chance for an upset? One of the best Duke teams I've ever seen was its 1999 team under Mike Krzyzewski. And they were so dominant all season long, undefeated in conference play. I believe steamrolled their first 4 opponents on the way to the Final Four in 1999. This year's Duke team and that Duke team are two of the most, I think they might be the 2 most dominant ACC basketball teams in conference play in the history of a 70-plus-year-old league. And it was a reminder in 1999 that you can have a beautifully constructed roster. You can have future NBA talent like an Elton Brand and a Shane Battier and a Trajan Langdon and others. You can have experience, which they had. You can have, in that case, it was an undefeated in ACC play Duke team in 1999. You can steamroll your way through the postseason, and stuff can just happen in the Final Four. In that case, it was Duke in the national championship game running into a well-coached UConn team with Khalid El-Amin at point guard and Rip Hamilton, another of the great players in UConn history, having a really big game to beat Langdon and Battier and Brand and the rest of that Coach K crew. So obviously, all 4 number 1 seeds still standing says a lot by itself. But the unique nature of this Kelvin Sampson team, it is the best shooting team that Kelvin Sampson has ever had, and yet he hasn't sacrificed anything defensively. Duke is a little taller. Duke has a little bit more NBA talent for sure than Houston does, maybe a lot more. But I like the Blue Devils in this game, but just like UConn was a scary matchup for a dominant Duke team in 1999 in the title game, I think Houston is a scary matchup in the semifinals for this year's Duke team, and I think the Cougars are an even scarier matchup than whoever, if the Devils win, whether they would face a Florida or an Auburn in the national title game.
Coach Keating, we're going to do an in-depth breakdown of the Duke Blue Devils with you, just like you would if you were on an assistant coaching staff and looking to play the Blue Devils. We'll do that a little bit later on this week. But I want to ask you right now, based on what David just said right now, is this a matchup that you feel like Duke could legitimately be pressed all the way to the point of maybe losing before Monday night?
I actually do, and I do based on the simple fact of a mantra that we lived by as a defensive-minded team at UCLA: ball pressure buys you time. And if you go back and watch the Alabama game, and keep in mind to come on top of David's point about tempo, Houston was the 5th slowest team in the entire country, not the tournament, country. And they played the 6th fastest team in Alabama by way of 14 extra possessions a game. The problem with Alabama, and I'm saying that Alabama liked to play to 75 possessions, Houston liked to play to 61, or that's where their averages fell. The problem with Alabama, as you go back and watch the game, was that against Duke, they were a little bit so concerned with all the other stuff going on, they couldn't tag or stop or switch or confront. Guys were just passing wherever they wanted to. It's the first point of attack in defending Duke. No matter who has the ball, whether it's Foster or James, whether it's Knipple, who's a facilitator, we all know Cooper Flagg facilitates on and on the roll, anyone that has the ball. And I go so far as to tell you this too: there's a decision you make as a coach and when to pressure the ball, when the post guys have it. And in this day and age of post guys being ball reversal, as we call DHO or zoom actions, which we're going to have one of in our film breakdown, Michael, you need to pressure Malawach out there with the ball too, because no one's ever done it. I've never seen anyone go out and say, you know what, we're going to go, when he catches that ball, we're going to be right up on him. And when he puts it down, we're not going to risk fouling him. We're going to make him feel the pressure and not just, oh, let me go dribble this and hand this off to Knipple and then I'll screen for Flagg and I'll roll. That's how he's been getting these roll dunks. There's no resistance. The resistance start when the guys have the ball. There was a play that we're going to break down where they ran a great zoom action and a back screen and a curl for Proctor, and he got a de facto downhill lob. And Sion James is like, I have nightmares of Ben in practice telling the other guys, okay, where do you want the ball? Where do you want the ball? Like, no, pressure the ball. And I'm telling you, if the referees allow Houston to physically pressure the ball early in the game to the tune of where Houston wins the first 5 minutes of the game, you're going to have a little bit of sphincter tightening over on the Duke bench. The other part of this, too, that has gone unsaid, if Jai Lucas is a head coach in the ACC, which he is, or Jay Lucas, I say Jay Lucas he was on Duke's bench. He was John's first hire. And I know Chris Carroll after the game, hey, guys are stepping up, doing a great job. Hey, bottom line is he ain't there. Now he'll be there. Trust me, I tell you, he'll be there in the prep. He'll try to help as best he can without, hurting Miami. But he's not on the bench, and he doesn't have that connection to be able to make those adjustments. And let's remember his pedigree from a pro father and a pro type system and all the places he's been can't be unmentioned, especially from a guard standpoint. The adjustments that Duke will have to make early on will almost exclusively have to be with how they handle the ball pressure. We'll break down all the actions that they have and what Houston can do to offset that. But if the referees allow some level of pressure and physicality on the ball, and Duke isn't successful in beating that pressure or handling it in intermediate actions, you could find yourself, if you're Duke, in a game in the 60s, in possessions that are under 70. Duke doesn't play crazy fast either. I mean, Florida plays at a sub 70 pace. Duke plays, I think, at a 65, 66, not that far off. But where Duke thrives is efficiency. You have to disrupt efficiency at the point of attack. You may see some earlier pickups. Let's use our physicality and our strength to wear their ball handlers down before they get over half court. It's all about disruption at the point of attack to start out, to buy time to navigate the actions, to pull Malawach and Cooper Flag away on the offensive end, but not let them get downhill and attack on the defensive end. It's going to be, I can't tell you how excited I am to see what happens between these two coaches, because I think it's clear as day from a coaching standpoint exactly what has to happen for both. It's just a matter of who gets it accomplished and which roster can do it more efficiently early on.
So that's Duke and Houston in the second game. Again, that's an 8:49 tip on Saturday night. The first game, the SEC Invitational, Florida and Auburn, both number one seeds. It tips at 6:09 p.m. in the Alamo Dome. And David Glenn, this is a game right here that, again, we talked about it throughout today's edition of Timeout. It's great teams. I mean, Florida is a strong basketball team. They look great in their regional win. Auburn has been one of the top teams all season long. A battle of a young coach against an old coach. So many stories right now that I know you can't wait to sink your teeth into as you look ahead to the Tigers and the Gators.
Yeah, to underline your starting point there, Mike, I've used as a rule of thumb when I give people bracket advice over the years, if you can find the rare teams that are top 10 in offensive efficiency and top 10 in defensive efficiency, out of 364 teams in Division I men's basketball, there's only going to be a handful in any given year. Guess who the four were this year? Florida, Auburn, Duke, and Houston. So all four qualify. And if you just use that rule of thumb to identify the pool of teams from which you might pick your national champion, you would have been picking from the correct pool something like 24 of the last 25 years. That's how rare these teams are, and yet all four fit the description this year. What's going to be fun to me is I remember Florida went to Auburn during the regular season. Neither team did a great job of stopping the other. It was more of an NBA type game in the way it unfolded. But Florida went to Auburn and beat the Tigers, I think it was almost by double digits, in like a 90-80 type game. And Walter Clayton of the Gators was the star of that show. And Auburn simply did not have an answer for him. And Bruce Pearl has said that game was in early February. So by the time this semifinal matchup rolls around on Saturday, it would be almost 2 months since Florida went to Auburn and beat the Tigers. Bruce Pearl says that the biggest improvement in his team over these last 2 months is on the defensive end of the floor, and that they would not be still standing in the national semifinals had they not tightened the screws at that end of the floor. They've been really good offensively with Jedi Broom, the first-team All-American big guy, and others for pretty much the entire season. Well, they've cultivated a defensive specialist. He's a 6'4" guy named Denver Jones. And obviously, Coach Keating can talk to these details better than I. But, I'm smart enough to know that when I watch Denver Jones play, dude is a flat-out baller at the defensive end of the floor. Well, Walter Clayton, is a flat-out baller at the offensive end of the floor. He's about 6'3". Denver Jones is about 6'4". Do you switch all the time on defense? There's a simplicity to that, right? But then Walter Clayton, anytime he sees Denver Jones on him, he's going to call for a screen and there's going to be a switch, and then Walter Clayton gets to do his magic against somebody who's not Auburn's best perimeter defender. So this is where the chess match comes back into play. I think, Auburn, Janai Broome is going to get his. Florida down low does have length, but they don't have a power length combination that is going to minimize Janai Broome. And by the way, in a losing effort, Janai Broome got his against Florida earlier this year. I don't think that's going to be a problem. The question to me is, can Auburn limit Walter Clayton, who, by the way, was also a first-team All-American? It's not mere coincidence that the 4 teams still standing. Duke has a first-team All-American in Cooper Flagg. Baylor has a third-team. Houston has a third-team All-American in L.J. Cryer. And this other semifinal matchup, first-team All-American Janai Broome in the post, first-team All-American Walter Clayton on the perimeter. What's Auburn's plan for Walter Clayton? And if they can at least just minimize him a little bit, who else on Florida steps up to fill that void? It's a guessing game at this point. I actually, Mike, in my original bracket, in our bracket challenge, Bacon and Basketball, etc., I have Duke beating Auburn in the national championship game. I am not eligible to win free bacon for a year, but if somehow Duke beats Houston, Auburn beats Florida, and then the Devils beat the Tigers, I'm going to get a whole lot of points down the stretch. But at this stage, I have way less confidence in any of these predictions than I had in some of the earlier rounds, because the bottom line is these coaches are great. Everybody has star players. Everybody is sharing the ball offensively. There's no super obvious weak link to attack. And that's what makes it fun. The unpredictability is part of the madness. And unless you have a favorite team and you're living and dying by their success, the rest of us are just kind of enjoying the spectacle. And that's exactly what it's going to be on Saturday night in San Antonio.
Harry, I know you're a Gator guy. Do you think that Auburn can put it together and get past Florida, or is this the Gators' game to lose?
Well, I'm a Gator guy, David, only because if the flip side of that, and if you're a Heat fan, Robert De Niro would say there's a flip side to that. If Florida beats Houston in the national championship game, we're going to be having bacon parties at the Keating household monthly, courtesy of North Carolina Pork Council. My first rookie year. It's all rookie year. So we'll see what happens. But nevertheless, from a basketball standpoint, I've been super impressed with Florida. Got a chance to see them in person here in Raleigh, play against UConn in the regional. Walter Clayton, a player who amazingly started his career as an overweight point guard by Rick Pitino's standards at Iona, and didn't make it to St. John's somehow, has obviously proven to be a bona fide pro in the sense that his mindset is incredible. His shot making is unbelievable, especially on the perimeter. Contested threes, and for a 6'3" guy to be able to make some of those shots. He had a dare I say, Steph Curry-like shot to put the game out of reach from a mid-lane rebound, dribble out, turnaround three. Amazing. They have a great glue guy in Will Richard. Elijah Martin is as good of an attacking guard, undersized wing as you're going to find. And really what's emerged in this is a little bit of front court depth, in that they don't have to rely on Chinaloo as much as playing Hawk and Condon together. And they were backing each other up. And Hawk had some great games. He has really efficient game in that early Auburn game that was a 10-point win that David referenced. He emerged in the Elite Eight as someone that, can help you win a game single-handedly. They have great depth. They have great confidence. And clearly, when you've escaped once already, you kind of feel like you got your get-out-of-jail-free card. And let's face it, they escaped. That game was in hand, and they made the run. They have weapons at three. They have weapons at the rim. They have, I think, maybe the most underrated, I mentioned, glue guy in the entire tournament in Will Richard. He's a guy that can get you 20 or get you 2, but still have a completely adverse effect on the outcome because he knows how to play. One of the more unselfish kids that I've seen that can score into making extra passes. Clayton being the guy that handles so much. Richard's kind of your de facto one more guy, but he's got the body on him that they can rebound him if they need to. He's also smart enough to play in transition D. Let's not also forget, I recall if it was just for 1 year, maybe two, I think for one, Todd Golden was on Bruce Pearl's staff. I kind of snuck in there in between all of his travel, Columbia to San Francisco to, he was at Auburn, if I recall, for at least a year, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a little bit of familiarity into the mindset of where Bruce is coming from Todd's perspective. And Todd has, clearly taken the route of being a little more stoic on the sideline than Bruce, kind of let the guys play a little bit. Bruce, fiery, emotional, in your face. Players play like that. The big thing I think this comes down to is Johni Broome actually fully healthy? I mean, let's admit he came back from a potentially game-ending injury and made a big three and finished the game and had his Willis Reed moment, if you will. This is a little bit of a contrast in styles on the sidelines that gets carried over onto the court. A little more freewheeling on the Florida side. You never really see Todd kind of get too high or low. And then really, the physicality and the emotion and the experience that Auburn has on the other side. And they're relentless. They're relentless on the boards. I've never seen a Michigan State team lose board battles like I did against Auburn. If Michigan State was going to win that game, they absolutely went in with the game plan. We have to out rebound them and win that percentage battle. I don't know what the numbers ended up being, but just from an eye test, they were getting matched physically and out rebounded at key times, and that's a key that I think is going to be probably the number one factor going into that Auburn-Florida game is who can win the rebounding battle on the offensive end and get more possessions. And whoever does that will most likely win that game.
I know who you guys picked on your brackets on our Bacon and Basketball Bracket Challenge brought to you by North Carolina Pork. But do you want to make any adjustments to your predictions? I mean, that was a few weeks ago. Now we know it's all number one seeds in San Antonio, Houston and Duke in the second game, Florida and Auburn in the first. Who do you guys want to throw out there is going to be who's playing on Monday night?
Well, I'm not backing off my Duke as the national champion, but if I were allowed to revisit, to Coach's point, as much as I believed in Auburn going into this tournament, having your first team All-American big man coming off a scary looking injury and not being sure how he's going to feel, that is not very comforting. I actually had Texas Tech upsetting Auburn. I mean, upsetting Florida rather. And for a while, I thought that was about to happen. I mean, that was their moment. The Gators were this close to going home, and they found a way, to their credit. So it's not. I never disliked the Gators. They're fun to watch. They're skilled. Clayton is just phenomenal. My old rule of thumb is if I could have either the All-American guard or the All-American forward, give me the guard, right? Because things can start in his hand. And unless your forward is a point forward like a Cooper Flag, you gotta get Johni Broome the ball, and then how good does he feel right now? There's also, I wonder, as Coach Keating gives his answer, I wonder, is there room in the game plan, Coach, to think about the fact that one of the key rotational players for Auburn is Chad Baker-Mazara, talented guy, but an absolute volcano waiting to erupt emotionally. I'm not saying it could happen to anybody once or twice. I played sports as a young man. There's a couple things I did that I wish I had not done. But for others, it's not just the occasional eruption. It's like it's wired into who you are. And Chad Baker-Mazara is like a technical foul waiting to happen. And I think an emotional roller coaster that could either be the lightning rod in a good way for Auburn or melt down in the wrong way for Auburn. I don't know if game plans are complicated enough if it's worth mentioning. Hey, this guy may have a screw loose, and if there's any way we can loosen that screw during the game, let's try to do it. But yeah, I would probably change my pick from Auburn to Florida for that Duke versus Florida national championship game, but I'll stick with the Blue Devils cutting down the nets, even as I admit, again, some of the best teams I've ever seen, coached by some of the best coaches that I've ever seen. Dean Smith, Mike Krzyzewski, Roy Williams, etc. Many of those best did not cut down the nets. And it's just, that's the reality this year. 3 really good basketball teams are going to go home without one of those little links of the net, or whoever gets the full net wrapped around their neck. That's just the nature of March Madness, right? Only one team gets to call itself that national champion. And this particular year, it's going to be at the expense of 3 other teams that are also capable of being the one to raise the trophy.
As you said that, David, I went back to the beginning of the season because it was documented that there were issues on the Auburn roster with who was involved in the game. And I couldn't remember who the player was. I think it was a couple of earlier freshmen. They weren't on the same page to start the season. They had to take a guy off a flight. There was a guy sulking on the court, mad he didn't get the ball when the ball's going in. I'll give Bruce a little bit of credit and his staff for kind of overcoming, because that can be something that can kind of drive a wedge in your team. It does speak a little bit to the maturity level and the older players that Auburn has. And I think in the case of Baker Mazar, he's 26 years old.
He's an older dude.
Yeah, so there may be a little bit of I can't stand dealing with these young guys anymore. I'm just going to lose my mind here. There's some volatility there. I wouldn't waver, to be honest with you, even after it's happened and gotten to this point, having chosen all 4, chalked to the Final 4, chosen Florida and Houston prior. I don't think I would change it. Obviously, for much of the reason that, as much as I'd love to see what the outcome of that first game with Duke and Houston is, this Florida-Auburn game, I feel like Florida's up to the challenge. I feel they're up to the task. Offensively talented enough. Dictating pace will be important. And then also, I think there's a level of offensive creativity and ability on the Florida staff, and Todd Golden and his staff, to put guys in bad spots. It's going to challenge Auburn defensively as much as any. And look, as we went back and talked about the efficiencies of Duke 2, 3, 4-man lineups, you have to get to the 4-man lineup before Johni Broome is the efficient player that he is in a lineup. He's not in their 2-man. He's not in their 3-man. As David pointed out, the one that no one's talking about that's in their 2-man is Denver Jones, right? And he's in the 3-man with Cardwell and Kelly. You have to get to 4 people on the floor with those guys, and it changes to Chad Baker and Broome and Denver Jones again and Cardwell before you have the most efficient defensive lineup. So it's not about getting Johni Broome out of the game. It's about attacking Denver Jones. And I gotta be honest with you. If there's any team in the Final 4 that's going to do exactly what we're doing right now to baseline their game plan going in, it's Florida. This is a guy who famously, up 4 years ago, fouled intentionally, up 4, right? Because 2's less than 3, and he and Kyle Smith have overanalyzed this entire thing. And I can respect it, because I was doing this with the now head coach at Appalachian State, Dustin Kearns, when he was on our staff in 2007. We were trying to overanalyze and analyze lineups to the umpteenth degree before we had the benefit of all these programs that can spit these back. We put the time in. I can appreciate that. And Moneyball was alive and well at Santa Clara. I can tell you that for years. This is the conversation that Todd's having right now. He's going right to the efficiency lineups. Their best one is with Denver Jones. Don't be shocked if they isolate and attack with either Richard or certainly Clayton early on in getting Jones out of the game. Martin, Hall, whatever the lineup is, they will be attacking him early on. Getting him off the floor is paramount to Florida's success. And I got to be honest with you, I will be mildly shocked if anyone else outside of this program actually emphasizes that point before they realize what it is come the game. Because I think, David, you hit the nail on the head. This is a guy that is super important to Auburn, is not getting a lot of national love right now because of all the other guys that they have.
NC Pork, good for the plate, great for the state.